Welcome to the webinar by the Built to Hold Venture Design Lab. So this one's the second of that two-part webinar series, and it's on the topic, designing ventures for profits, not exits. So the focus of the webinar is in helping people understand again that when you're building ventures to hold for realized profits, you've got to approach the innovation process really differently than somebody who's building a venture to exit like a VC fund. And that's because there are financial constraints that are very different that you're working under. So last week, we unpacked the financial implications of lean startup and what we were described as the search and discovery approach, and why that search and discovery approach sets anyone building ventures to hold for their cash flows up for failure. So today, we're going to help answer the problems we highlighted, and we're going to overview a new innovation method that we call Fit Startup. And it's designed for those building to hold and investing in long-term sustainability. Since we've got some new faces today, we'll do just a quick repeat of intros and a real short overview of last week. So my name is Erik Simanis, and I've got two hats. I'm co-director of the lab, which I'll tell you about a bit more in just a sec. I'm also founder of a venture design firm called Half Solved. Our name comes from the engineering saying that a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And over the past 30 years, the problem I've been focused on and trying to figure out is how do you innovate new market-creating ventures profitably? And it's that last word that has been the key focus. I was drawn into the space back when I was working on my MBA and had a stint in a new venture team inside Monsanto back in the life sciences days. That landed me in a doctoral program at Cornell, looking at this topic. From there, I ran a lab at Cornell where we were building ventures and testing a methodology in field with companies like DuPont, SC Johnson, Procter & Gamble, a vision care company called Sightsavers. And that turned into co-founding a venture incubation company where we've guided just a couple dozen ventures for a whole range of companies across industries like Barclays, BMW, Pearson Education, Unilever, Disney, Mars, and also applied this to a number of clean tech startups focused on emerging markets. And through all of that, we've defined the problem really well. We've unpacked the science behind what we see as the key drivers and determinants of profitable venture creation. And out of this has come a methodology and a practice that we think can create a real step change in success rates. And Half Solved and the lab were both created to put the science as well as the practice into the world. Just my slide means. So just a quick word about the lab itself. So the lab is a partnership between Half Solved, our firm, the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell, and INCOSE, the International Council on Systems Engineering. So INCOSE is a key partner because the methodology and the science really draws on systems engineering. I mean, it's the foundation for the entire practice in science. And the mission of the lab is to advance and disseminate the science and methodology. And we've got two main thrusts. We've got one that's just focused on training, where we do workshops, courses, webinars like this one that provide an avenue for people to get kind of an introduction to the method and the science base. And then we also undertake these, we're calling them applied research projects. The one that we used last week when we highlighted Amazon, we unpacked Amazon and looked at how Amazon's return looks really different through a build to hold perspective. That came out of a research project that started in the lab. We have another research project that I want to highlight with the MIT Alumni Angels Network that's about taking this science and not using it for building, but actually on the investor's guide for doing venture screening and due diligence. We've got three of us who are going to be tag teaming the session today. In addition to me, there's Patrick Donohue. He's the other co-director of the lab and CEO for Half Solved, and Mark Eady, who joined us last week as well. Mark was an EIR in the lab up until last year when he joined Ajinomoto Group Ventures. I'm going to hand off to Patrick in just a sec, and I'll let him give a little bit of a more detailed, proper introduction. And the same for Mark. Mark will join us, come into this conversation a little bit later in the session. And as we did last time, just process-wise, it's just really hard in the webinar structure to kind of field questions live as we're going through. So if you would just put down any questions, just drop them straight into the chat. Patrick is going to be kind of staying on top of that. If there's something we can address kind of right in the moment, we'll do that. Otherwise, we're going to have some time at the back end for some discussion. And if we can't even get it there, we'll be sure to follow up kind of at the end of the webinar. So with that, Patrick, I will hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Erik. Again, Erik, give a little bit of an introduction for me. I'm the co-director of the Built to Hold Lab alongside him and the CEO of Half Solved. Just briefly, my career has focused on 0 to 1 ventures and innovations. This is both at startups, working with Erik, on some of the ventures that we work together on in different parts of the world, but also working at companies like Facebook and Automatic and Rockwell International. We faced a lot of problems that Erik and team and the science that they created did a really good job of explaining. And so what we're going to dive in today, we're going to talk about some of those problems that we faced. We're going to move ahead and talk about what is structurally creating those problems, and also then look at what is the way that we can address it using the science that's been developed at Cornell University and beyond. Do you want to go ahead, Erik? So right. So last week again. No, go ahead. Last week, we dove into the core problem. Innovators building ventures to hold for the profits and applying a method that digs a deep financial hole, one that the time value of money makes impossible to fill in. Today, we're going to focus on the solution. We're going to talk about these 3 pillars of robust venture design that are based on that science that Erik discussed, and we're going to look at. We're going to dive deeper on these 3 venture design pillars, while also understanding what is it that they're solving for. So go ahead and jump ahead. So recapping the problem, you can see it here. Lean startups approach is searching for a profitable business model, i.e. the idea of experimenting and pivoting live in market with a customer-driven MVP. It has an extremely low probability of success, low single digits, requires more than 10 years running the venture at a loss, which is often 40% or more of revenue, to even know if a path to profit even exists. This has implications for, depending on the type of investor you are, the type of builder you are. The implication for VC funds is like, well, VC funds handle this. They succeed despite these conditions, because they can take diversity across 100 ventures or more. They can build a portfolio approach. And then the big get out of jail free card for them is they can exit at a multiple of revenues while ventures are still unprofitable. They don't need a single venture in their portfolio to be profitable for them to make money for their investors. And so it's why they're focused so much on product market fit and revenue growth. It fits their investment thesis. From the corporate perspective, companies building ventures to hold for the realized cash flows, you can't really dig out of that financial hole because of time value of money. This is something we went into detail in the last session. You can review the recording of it if you haven't seen it yet. But really, the time value of money, this long time to getting to profitability, means it pushes up the required profits to a level well beyond what can be delivered by the opportunity. So go ahead, Erik. So the takeaway from all of this, the summary is, if you're building a hold where you pay your bills from the realized cash flows of your business, not from exiting, you need an innovation method that has a couple of key parameters. It has to drive up success rates, it has to drive down validation times, and it has to drive down validation cash. You have to increase your rate of success, your probability of success. You need to make it happen faster and with less money. And it's worth noting that this isn't only relevant to corporations. Anybody else has this characteristic where they're looking, the value they're going to get out of it is from the profits the business generates itself, not from an exit. You have what we call legacy entrepreneurs, people that are never intending to exit their business. The business is going to pay for itself. Or you have the idea of deep impact investors, people who want to create a vehicle that has an impact on the world. They're not just looking to exit. They're trying to create something that offers lighting to people that don't have it, that improves health outcomes and other types of impacts. These type of people need a different approach. But go ahead. So we want to take a few minutes to dive deeper on the why of the problem. What is it that structurally drives these low success rates with lean startup? And again, by success, we mean reaching a profitable business that creates a positive return on the investment put into it. And so the low success rates and long costly validation times, they're not natural to venture creation. Not all ventures suffer from this. They're structural to what lean startup does and how it does it. And the way that the method approaches the innovation challenge and creates these financial outcomes. It is And we'll talk through how this happens. Go ahead. So what is that's involved in the creating a low probability of success as we've defined it? The first is at the heart of lean startup is this idea of open-ended idea generation. It seems open, but without explicit criteria, like invariably people actually anchor from where they are or who they know. You can see this through this quote from Jason Friedman of Y Combinator. You're encouraged to start searching from what you know. Think of things you wish someone else would build for you. Look for an idea based on what you're good at. What would you be excited to work on? But if profitability is the goal, why start at those points? Open-ended idea generation without assessing profitability potential, or even the means to do so, makes you susceptible to working on dead ends or in local optimums with sufficient monetizability. I use the phrase local optimums, and it's something you look into. I'm a computer scientist by training. The idea of what they call hill climbing algorithms, this problem is really well known. Iteration, trying to solve something through iteration when you start on a small hill means you just end up on the small hill. You'll miss a larger mountain in the distance. So you end up on a local optimum. And if you're not explicit, intentional about where you start, you can run into these problems. So what this ultimately leads to is it pushes down your monetizability. You're working on things that you've been anchored around something that is not necessarily the most optimal solution, the most profitable solution in the opportunity space, but one that is anchored closer to where you are. And the key to this again is making, the open-ended idea generation you actually do anchor on something. You're just not being explicit or intentional about what it is you should be anchoring on. Similarly, around with the second piece that drives down probability of success, which is anchored around customer needs. The challenge here is epitomized by the quote, if I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse, which was Steve Jobs attributing or referencing Henry Ford. A core challenge of market creation when you're trying to create something new is that customers are rooted in their current reality and routines. They're frequently blind to big problems or opportunities. So what happens when you anchor yourself to customer needs is you also anchor yourself to areas with low monetizability. This often leads to ideas that are more about annoyances with low value versus the big step change in value that you need to create a high probability of success. And the final driver is you build your product to be optimized for the customer. On the surface, it seems like a good thing, but any systems engineer will caution you that optimizing for a single function invariably pessimizes an entire system. An inventor is a system, one that needs to create value for customers, yes, but also one that needs to deliver on other critical business functions with as efficient of a cost structure as possible. If you look at WeWork, which delivered tremendous customer value, I mean, for me, it was amazing as someone that ran a startup. I had a startup office with the flexibility of a co-working space, but it had a completely untenable cost structure. So what this does for you is it pushes down, go ahead, Erik, it pushes up your cost structure. Products optimized for customers have a huge impact on how you can deliver cost in the long run. It also has impact later, as we'll talk about. Go ahead. So what does this do? So pushing down monetizable value and driving up cost structure, it narrows and potentially forecloses the path to profitability from the very start. What you see here is a notion that came out of Cornell and Erik's work there, and the concept of a value surplus. In this case, you have what's called a negative value surplus. You set things up such that the value you can deliver to customers always falls below, or frequently falls below the cost that it takes to deliver that value. And what that means is you can iterate as much as you want in different business models. No amount of time or experimentation is going to get you out of this hole. You are structurally in a place where the cost, the cost of what you want to deliver is above the value that you can. Go ahead. And so here's some of the examples of companies that fell prey to this. So we'll dive into more of a specific example on one of them. But all these are companies that had, to some degree or another, so-called product market fit. But they ended up with untenable cost structures or value that just wasn't enough to be able to cover what it was that it cost to deliver it. And therefore, in terms of a path to profitability, it was either extremely narrow or didn't exist ever. Now, going over to the other piece that we talked about, having long, costly validation times. There are two structural drivers that lead to these long times as you're trying to search for a profitable business model. The first, again, is open-ended experimentation, where you're building and testing without well-defined performance and profitability requirements. If you don't, in essence, if you don't question which way is north or have the ability to assess which way is north, and here north is a profitable company, you're unlikely to reach the destination anytime soon. You spend a lot of time iterating around, you launch your MVPs, you get initial customer feedback. You don't even know if you're in the right place or which direction is the way to go. And again, like we're not, the important piece to understand here, this is not a value thing. It's not people not trying hard enough or being smart enough. It's not measuring the right thing. There's something structural going on, which we're going to talk about. The second driver is lean startups' reliance on learning live in market. This is extremely costly. Well, there's some things true that you can only validate live. Going live introduces tremendous complexity. It obscures root causes and has big ripple effects across all your operations. It also anchors you to a form factor that becomes more and more costly to change. The further you are in market, the harder it is to change. The more customers you have, the harder it is to bring them along to something new. And it's important to note that lean startup came out of really like the big examples that you see of being successful are in the SaaS world, where it feels like costs are really low. Software, easy to change software, very minimal cost. But the truth is there's all these other knock-on effects in your operations with your customers as you change what you're doing. And the more complex you get, the more costly it gets to change. Pivoting is increasingly expensive the further along you go. And this is worse, much worse for hard tech companies. Anybody where pivoting is actually anything that requires regulatory approval, any of these things that really cost a fixed investment up front, is just a non-starter. Go ahead. So let's take a brief look at, deeper dive on one of the previously touched examples, and this is subscription meal kits. And we're going to talk specifically about the former unicorn, Blue Apron. But it's worth noting that this wasn't just a Blue Apron problem. This was every single subscription meal company had suffered from these similar problems. And so, it started pretty strongly. Like Blue Apron in particular in 2016, it was shipping 3 million meal kits per month. It had strong product market fit. But at its core, it had a number of issues. And one was solving this idea of solving for time-saving convenience. It was using a subscription meal kit as a way to help families put dinner on the table and save time. It created distribution logistics problems. And then you had the high perishability of pre-cut fresh meals and meats and vegetables. It also created a sales and marketing challenge of having to convince customers that paying $10 for ingredients that really only costs $4 at the grocery store is worth the time savings that it's giving you. And it created a retention challenge of hanging on to customers. There were competitors offering free signups. There are people that signed up to Blue Apron with at a lower rate that churned as soon as that was done. And the company, to their credit, they iterated relentlessly to try to work around these issues. They tried doing delivery through grocery stores instead to cut down on logistics costs. But that opened them up to competing alongside every other food option in the store and also compromised their time-saving value proposition. I got to go to the store to pick this up. Like, why don't I just buy the ingredients myself instead of paying for this? They expanded to 50 meal options. They partnered with celebrity chefs. They had strategic partnerships with healthcare, fitness, e-commerce, and beyond. They developed an automated distribution center and fired a whole bunch of their packing workers. They sourced ingredients directly from farmers. None of it worked. And eventually they were acquired after accumulating hundreds of millions of dollars in losses for a fraction of what was invested in them. So overall, we had these key pieces. You had time-saving convenience, the value proposition, which, talking to customers, it seems like, it'd be great if we could save some time. But it led to a value, monetizability that was actually quite low, which was evidenced by the high customer churn. It was costly marketing to acquire those customers in the first place. So in terms of your CAC and the time, the time to pay back of your CAC, they never met it. The cost structure was crippled by it was just an extremely expensive idea. Shipping fresh ingredients was extremely difficult. And then it took them a long time and they accumulated a lot of losses, and they were acquired at a fraction. of what they had originally been worth. And again, it's worth noting that this wasn't just Blue Apron. Every meal subscription kit company suffered from this problem. So from here, we're going to move on. So this is, again, describing some of the structural issues that come up with lean startup. And we're going to move ahead, and Eric's going to start diving into, like, okay, how do you deal with them then? These issues exist. How do you tackle them? How do you bring down the amount of cash that you need? How do you bring down, how do you increase the value of what you're creating? How do you handle all these different challenges that come from creating a new venture in a new market?
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. All right. Well, as you said, let's dig into a little bit about, we've done enough of knocking things down. Let's start building some stuff up. So we'll dig into kind of this new science and practice for building ventures when you're building and investing to hold. And just to be clear, so this isn't about taking kind of the search and discovery approach and then doing it more rigorously. So it's not about spending more time and more effort doing filling in your business model canvas, doing more extensive or deeper customer discovery. What we're going to talk about, really, it flips lean on its head. I kind of used the reference about the Copernican revolution. So we are going to tell you that the sun isn't revolving around the earth. And the big shift in this way of innovating ventures is that it treats positive NPV, the measure of profit that captures both the risk as well as time value of money. We're going to use it as the objective function. So Patrick, was talking about how, the function that's being used in the lean startup, particularly in idea selection, is more around kind of accessibility. Here we have this really explicit objective function guiding and driving the whole process. It's the North Star that's going to dictate where you put your time and energy. And as we talked about last week, there are 3 big financial parameters that drive NPV: probability of success, validation time, validation cash out. And that first one is in bold because it is the most important one. Not only does it impact on that one, but it also cascades and spills into the other 2. If you're successful at launch, your validation time and cash out go to 0. So it is the one that I just can't emphasize, like, all focus should be on, like, what is it that's going to give us the greatest chance of probability at success? And this new practice, we engineer ventures to have that step change and do so by asking and solving very different questions than lean. So the questions and the stuff we'll talk about, they aren't sitting on the business model canvas. And that's why we are not going to double down more and spend more time on those things. We're going to look at different questions and issues altogether. All right. So we call this method, we call it Fit Start. And it's got 2 core principles and 3 core practices. And all of those are in service of those 3 financial parameters that drive NPV. So principle 1 is that you design your idea for robustness, not the customer. And by robustness, we mean that the venture can absorb and withstand uncertainty. Uncertainty in terms of costs and uncertainty in terms of demand. So of course, the customer is part of the robustness equation, but there's a lot more that a venture has to solve for, that its design has to address in order to be robust. And going again, like, why robustness? And again, robustness is the single biggest determinant of probability of success. The more robust the venture, the higher probability that when you launch, you're successful. And as we said before, then we've got those knock-on effects on validation time and cost. Principle 2 is to pivot on paper, not in market. Most design, you've got to design in such a way that you can prove and feel confident that that venture works before you launch into market. And again, why? It's because making those big changes in field, this goes back to last week, literally research shows it's 1,000 times more costly, and it's far more time consuming than when you actually learn and pivot on paper. Learning and experimenting live with real built stuff is just the most expensive, costly, time consuming way to learn. So these 2 principles are carried through into 3 core practices of Fit Startup. So these aren't sequential steps. They all work together kind of in tandem. And what I'm going to do is I'll just give a high-level overview here. During the rest of the presentation, we'll double-click on each of the practices. So practice number 1, we call it fortifying financial vital signs. And essentially, you got to design your venture to drive for two key metrics. We call them customer ROI and your margin of safety. Ultimately, those two measures tell you how robust your venture is. But to design a venture that has those two strong vital signs, we've got to design out barriers that are holding it down. And that's practice two. We call it innovate around structural profit barriers. Because there's a reason everyone's ideas for new markets hasn't already been done. And it's because there are deep value and cost barriers that are driving down what you can do for the customer and driving up your costs. Practice two finds and engineers around those. But to come up with a solution that gets around those profit barriers and does so in a robust way and that you can evaluate, you've got to triangulate using testable logic. You've got to be building for these things in a way that you have clarity about the science behind the problem and the science behind your solution. Because if you don't, there's no way you can test and pivot on paper. So that's practice three. And so to summarize, the testable logic, it's the basis for building robust strategies. And it's these robust strategies is what's needed to circumvent the barriers and ultimately give us the strong vitals. So what we'll do is we'll go through each one of these three in a little bit more detail. Advance, there we go. So practice number one, fortify financial vital signs. So ultimately, the probability that your venture is profitable at launch is driven by two numbers. The first one is customer ROI. And it is mathematically, it's the spread between kind of the high end of customer willingness to pay and the low end of the value that the solution creates for the customer. A big customer ROI, means you can now absorb the lower than anticipated efficacy of your product. In other words, if you create less value than you think your product might, if you have a big customer ROI, it can still accommodate that. The other key thing with the customer with customer ROI is that it's probably the biggest driver ultimately of how many customers buy your product and how fast they convert. So it has just enormous impact on the speed of cash coming in, which again translates back into our NPV question. So what's a good target number? As always, the bigger the better. But research shows, just to give you some sort of numbers to anchor on. So for low ticket priced items, research shows that if you're at a 50% customer ROI, that there's enough upside to the risk that you're exposed to for someone to go ahead and give it a shot. But once you get up into higher ticket priced items, you need to be in kind of the 300 to even the 1,000% range in order to drive kind of the conversion and sustained adoption. And so the second number is the margin of safety. Again, mathematically, it's going to be the spread between the high end of your estimated unit cost. And we can say full unit cost because this is including your cost of capital. It's like everything in there, that number is what you need to be profitable and pay back investors. The difference between that number and the low end of what customers are willing to pay for the product. So if you have a high margin of safety, I can now absorb a lot of unanticipated costs. I can absorb costs that are higher than I was even forecasting. And same kind of thing goes here. Obviously, the bigger, the better. But as a reference point, there's research that shows that for big projects, you can almost routinely expect to at least be sitting at a 60% cost overrun. So the higher you get with the margin of safety, the higher that you can get with a customer ROI, the better starting chance you have that upon launch, this thing is profitable. And let me give you a little example of Airbnb, just to bring this to life, kind of these concepts. So Airbnb is probably, it's one of those rare lean startup success stories. And we use this as an exercise just to see kind of what explains Airbnb. It's one of these companies that it grew explosively and it was pretty much cash flow positive from operations from start. They had accounting losses because they were spending to grow, but they were profitable on a full unit cost basis. And so we ran these numbers just to say and we did some backcasting, obviously. We were saying when Airbnb launched, what would their customer ROI and margin of safety have looked like? And keep in mind again that, for Airbnb and the way we've run these, we've shown this here, it's the host who's the customer. That was the founder's main customer when they started. It's like helping people basically earn extra money. And I'm not going to go through this in depth, but just try to explain. So we treated a unit of product as a 7-night stay and the average revenue it could generate, which is a measure of the value that the host gets at the end of the day. And then we estimated willingness to pay by looking at how many months of someone's mortgage payment could be covered, and say, like, given the inconvenience, if you will, like what would someone pay? What would someone pay to what would someone expect they would need to get in return for that inconvenience? And then we extracted a lot of these full unit costs, just looking at Airbnb's P&L. And so you can see here, what we got. We got a customer ROI of 116 and a margin of safety of 133%. Margin of safety, that's really big. Particularly when you think about we're dealing with a full digital product. But it may sound at first, given what I just shared about customer ROI, that like the bigger the ticket item, the higher it has to be. So 116 may sound kind of low, but when you think about it, the situation for an Airbnb host isn't that they're having to put this cash up. They're not paying $350 or $600 in the hopes of getting a $1,500 paycheck. They actually have no money up front. They have like zero risk other than the inconvenience and the effort they put in there. So, the reference point for what's like a healthy customer margin in their case was probably down more in the low ticket item, which when you look through that lens, you see like that's a huge customer ROI. And so it really helps explain why they were uniquely successful at launch, and they didn't have to end up going searching for a profitable business model. So before we go on, let me show you like how using kind of these two using the objective functions around customer ROI and thinking about margin of safety, using them as your North Stars, how it even changes how you think about your venture starting point. So this will kind of build off of what Patrick was sharing earlier. So I've got up here 3 characteristics of a good idea by Paul Graham, who's the founder of Y Combinator. And when you look at something you want and need, something you can build, something others don't realize is worth doing. And when you kind of sit and think about them, I said they're really telling, because if your goal is to get to product market fit, to get a product quickly into market, show that I can get customers buying, it's like these actually really make a lot of sense, because we're actually solving for, going back to what Patrick was saying, is like, what's accessible? What can I do? The other thing that I'll just want to point out that it does that's real problematic, it mashes up a problem and a solution from the start. It's what you want and need, but also what you can build. So it's already kind of getting us to think about both sides of the equation. And we'll won't go into depth about this, but like that very move itself just becomes a real killer when the goal is robustness. And the difference with fit. So with fit, we start with what we call a prime commercial opportunity. And the goal there is we want to find the opportunity space that is financially most robust through the lens of what we've been discussing. And you do that process, you start by choosing either, are you going to focus on technology, or are you going to focus on the market problem? Because we want to find use cases or impact cases that can most effectively kind of maximize, the size of an opportunity, either the value that we can get from a technology, or find the biggest space that we can solve the problem in the most kind of fundamental, impactful way. And then most importantly, we're going to do some, what I call it kind of weather veining in terms of numbers, to understand which one is the financially most robust. And I'm going to give a little example here to bring this to life. So one of the startups that we spent a day with was trying to commercialize a technology that, if you picture this, picture a kite that's tethered to the ground. This kite is up in the air and it's capturing high altitude currents and using that to actually power this winch that's generating energy. So it's a really novel way to generate energy that comes with some unique attributes. And it became clear from us that they were using kind of accessibility again as the starting point for their idea to their detriment. So they explained that their idea explained that their idea was we're going to replace all these giant windmills that are putting energy into the grid. Ultimately, we want to be the thing powering the grid. And again, why? Like, why start there? Like, why is that the idea? And they're like, well, yeah, obviously the grid powered generation, billions of dollars. The team had a ton of expertise from that industry. They could talk in detail about, the levelized cost of energy. They saw this kite technology. They saw, it just has this real disruptive potential, because when you're high up in the air, all those air currents are really consistent and stable. So you get almost like uninterrupted continual energy generation, which obviously you don't get, with these kind of conventional windmills. And it was green. And so they were envisioning bolting these tethered kites, onto these big bases that were already kind of there, whenever kind of the end of life of a windmill happened, and even for new installations. But if you look at this from a financial robustness perspective, it was a pretty weak way to start, a venture. So we ran them through an exercise, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, but this is just to give you a sense of like, how do you come up with a very different starting point? Come up with what we call that prime commercial opportunity, where you're using robustness as the lens. So the first thing we did, we talked them through like, all right, give me a sense of like, what's the core functionality behind this technology in its manifestation? So what does it do, and how does it work at just the most basic abstract level? And you see here kind of how we defined it. And next we talked about, well, what are the attributes that uniquely come out of that type of functionality? So things from, obviously, we mentioned the stable, the consistency, it's green. You have a certain output of energy that's happening. There's an inherent mobileness to this. Then we went through the process saying like, well, what are broad use cases where those attributes kind of are uniquely deployed? And by broad use cases, where you have a group of people who kind of who have a basic application or value that they're deriving from this kind of attribute and functionality. And we broke it out into three main kind of groups, kind of big, what happens in the B2B space, in the B2C, in B2G. And you see here the kinds of things that we brainstormed. And I pulled out just kind of the ones that we then moved forward into this next piece, which is about running the numbers behind it. And so the question we were trying to answer with these numbers is just which of these broad opportunity spaces can most credibly generate at scale cash flows that can pay back the required investment capital the opportunity would probably require at a competitive rate of return. And it sounds really technical and complex, but it's something you can really easily back envelope. And we got a template that we create for it. And again, I'm not going to run through this thing in detail, but just to give you a sense. So the first thing we did for each of the use cases is like, just figured out like, all right, well, what is the at scale? What's a customer base you can expect to get from this? The next thing we did, we said, all right, well, approximately how much cash needs to be generated in order to cover the investment capital that kind of targeting these use cases would likely require. Then from there, we asked, okay, well, if that's what we need, then what is the amount of cash flow at scale this thing needs to be kicking off? And then lastly, we were able to say like, all right, what's the amount of revenue and the net profit that has to be generated in order to create those at scale cash flows? And so we were able to this is again, back enveloping. I know they were kind of big assumptions, but that's okay because we're just weather vaning. We're trying to look for big order of magnitude change. And then what we did is for each of these, we just sense checked them and said like, all right, given the urgency and importance of the use case, like, is that amount of money being asked from the customer? Is it reasonable? Is it really low? Is it really high? And so this is how you can start off right from the beginning of where we're looking for a problem that's already informed and defined by where there is the biggest opportunity and chance to get to net, to NPV positive. All right, move forward. All right, practice number two. Practice number two, innovate around structural profit barriers. Because if there is one thing that I've learned over the past 30 years in kind of working in this space, is that there's a reason someone hasn't already solved the problem that you think holds so much value, or the technology that you've come up with that you think holds so much promise. there is always a structural barrier to profitability. There is something that's inherent in that problem space or that technology that is suppressing value and it's driving up cost. And it's why that quote white space still exists. And I've got over here, just to give you an example, bring this to life, because I'll have a lot of people say like, yeah, but the technology just didn't exist or was too mature. Look at electric cars. Electric cars, it is not a new technology. I mean, electric cars have been around. I think they even preceded combustion engines. They've been around from the late 1900s. And a really unique little kind of quirk. In the UK, they have these, in the industry called milk floats, the vehicles that deliver milk direct to people's homes. They have been electric since the early 1900s and have continued. There's some that have switched over to petrol, but they still continue to be electric. So it can be possible to have a market. And there's a reason why the mass market isn't all using electric cars. And it's not because the technology hasn't reached maturity. It's just that there are huge structural profit barriers. And it's worth looking at Tesla because, again, there's a reason they are the only non-Chinese manufacturer of electric cars that's profitable. They had their first profitable quarter 10 years after launching, and they had the first full year of profit 17 years. It may sound long, but it's actually astonishing when you consider the CapEx investment that it takes to get into manufacturing, the high R&D cost that it comes, and the long learning curve that just inherently comes with producing electric cars. But the key thing is they're profitable precisely because Musk circumvented these profit barriers that are kind of buried deep in electric car company. And the secret is that Tesla's not an electric car company. If they were, they'd also be unprofitable like everybody else. I use the term for them. I think it's more accurate to call them an energy transformation company because, yeah, they sell electric cars, but they sell regulatory credits and access to the charging grid to all the legacy auto companies. They sell the same battery technology in the car as a home energy backup system and part of a solar energy system. And they've got energy services as well. So if you eliminate all those elements of Tesla, you'd be left with a money-losing electric vehicle company like Rivian, Fiskars, and all the other legacy manufacturers who've tried to just jump in and make an electric car. Oops. And the key point, though, is that the ability to generate the big customer ROI and the high margin of safety, it happens by circumventing these profit barriers and eliminating them. It's not about optimizing them. And this is it's a completely different mindset that you have to go into. You're not trying to say okay, that all comes with it. Now we have to figure out how to do things optimally. We're going to figure out a way to circumvent it altogether. And a key part of the science that we've developed over this past period has been really isolating where these structural profit barriers arise. And we've distilled them into 10. And they're grouped into these three main categories that you see here. First three profit barriers, they all sit in what I call just foundational operations. The next four, they all deal with getting customers to reliably adopt a new product. And the last three all deal with hanging on to customers and the cash that you're actually generating. And we're not going to delve into the 10. The goal isn't to get you to learn them, but it's more about just being aware of them. And we're going to dip our toe into the first couple of these in just a little bit. Now, the key to circumventing the barriers, kind of these 10 barriers, rather than landing in that optimization trap, is to productize strategies. And by that, I mean you want to mold and shape the product idea to channel strategies to circumvent the barriers. So this goes back to the very first thing of why we design for a robust venture. You're optimizing for robustness, not the customer. It's for this reason. But why do we do that? Why is it you got to reshape and rethink the very product idea? Why do we have to be an energy transformation company versus just an electric car company? And it gets back to if you optimize the product to circumvent the barriers, what happens is you dramatically cut down the workload that now lands on the business model. I guess the way I describe it is like, the product actually becomes easy to make and sell, and then to hold on to kind of the cash and your customers. The other thing it does, and this is a Musk term, and that's what I mean. Musk is implicitly just really using this core logic of how he builds ventures. He used the term, you delete parts. When you productize these strategies, you eliminate a whole bunch of business model activities you otherwise would have to have, and all the resources that go behind them. And that's where you get these big jumps in cost and value. I mean, it's just an essential principle of, I'll call it whole systems design, systems engineering, design engineering. It is like the principal foundation, the foundational principle of those disciplines for how you innovate these new breakthrough systems. And I got my little sport because I think it's just, it provides such a nice little quick visual for like the idea of like, I've got these two things I'm trying to solve, but if I bring them together into one new product idea, I've reduced, basically my material cost by 50%. All right, well, let me bring this to life a little bit. Let me bring it to life by giving you an overview of how the microfinance industry, industry that probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, but it's an industry that's focused on mostly emerging market customers below a certain income level, how it became just a raging success. So before the microfinance industry came about, you had all these small farmers like the woman you see here, and you had petty traders like the woman you see here. And all of them, if they had working capital credit, they could buy fertilizer, they could buy additional stock, all that could be used to make more money. But there was no credit product out there for them, which again is really strange because, working capital loans for a small business, it's just such a commonplace routine thing. But no one was providing working capital loans to these people because there were precisely these structural profit barriers. And then along came an economist, Muhammad Yunus, who later won the Nobel Prize for this his innovation. He innovated around the profit barriers and came up with a completely new product idea, or kind of a new form factor for how what the product is. And so instead of a risk screen working capital business loan, which was the existing product form factor, he came up with the idea of let's call it a peer group loan and support group with mutual loan responsibility. And what the product idea did was this. It circumvented first the need to even do any of this costly due diligence, which is a central way that in the conventional model, you go about evaluating someone's risk. But these customers, they don't have FICO scores. They don't have tax returns. So what he did instead was say, let me just harness peer pressure and peer support to change people's repayment behaviors. The same product idea, it also created really high repayment rates by creating a sense of mutual loan responsibility. If I know that I'm responsible for everybody else's success, I'm going to be sure that I put my best foot forward and make this happen. So by having such a high success rate, it went over like 98%, you could drop down the interest rate to a level that it generated these really high customer ROIs. The other thing that happened in these peer groups is that the self-formed nature of them, it just drove customer acquisition. It created all these kind of economies of scale in the actual operations because all transactions were conducted in a group setting, whether it's loan issuance, customer care, cash collection. So you had these huge efficiencies in operation. You cut out a whole bunch of my headcount, and that drove down my costs even further. So I just kept boosting my margin of safety. And so it is, again, like Airbnb, it's why microfinance, it grew explosively from these very humble beginnings. And it remains a really profitable global market. It's like at $200 billion, and it's still growing today like at a rate of 10% annually. All right, well, let's jump on to the last and final one. And we call it the practice number 3, triangulate using testable logic. What we mean by testable logic is that the strategies you're developing to get around these 10 profit barriers, they should be capable of being evaluated by scientific reasoning. Because if you can't explain how it works scientifically, you can't model with high fidelity. And it's the high fidelity which lets you come up with credible values for customer ROI and your margin of safety. I can also now stress test models and I can see where I've got these operational and strategic risks. And it's all that together that lets me pivot on paper. So it's what lets you do practice 1 and practice number 2 really well. And I've got on here what I mean by like you have a testable science base. So if you look back at the history of human flight, for 1,000 years, we have people trying to fly, get human flight by trying to mimic birds. So like I think I could fly if I can mimic a bird, or I believe if I can move my arms and replicate what a bird does, I'll be able to fly. Since you have no scientific basis behind that, the only way you can figure out if that actually holds is by actually getting out there and doing it. But the moment I actually get down to the science and I can unpack the science, Bernoulli's principle of like what is actually like creating and would let me get my inertial mass off the ground. Now I can actually start to design, build, test things just in logic, and I can start to simulate things. If I understand the scientific basis how something works, I don't have to build and test. So I can do now my pivot on paper. We've created for all those 10 profit barriers that we talked about, we've actually gone through, we've mapped out a pathway to come up with a testable train of logic for all 10 of them. And again, the goal isn't to go through this and have you understand it. It's just know that this exists and conceptually what it enables and does. I'm just going to go through, and we're going to do just a quick little example. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a case that was involved a global food company that we worked with. You know what? I'm just going to jump. Well, let me go through this just to give you a sense of how the testable logic works. I'm just doing a time check. How the testable logic works. First thing is like we come up with really clear, precise definitions for everything. And it's not just to sound smart. It's just so that we want to be sure that we have perfect alignment with the team of people who are building and trying to solve these things. It's how you create alignment, and it's how you can work on things systematically. So we've got to have real definitional clarity. And this first box just defines what's the profit barrier you're solving for. And in this number 1, it's the at-scale cost bottleneck. There's some key operation that's going to drive up my cost structure. The next box, what it does, it tells me, all right, if that's what we're solving for, what's the kind of the basic information research input I need in order to solve for it? And in this case, we want to know, well, what's the default or conventional way either this tech would be commercialized or the problem solved? So in the microfinance thing we just went through, risk screen small business working capital loans, it's the default. It's the way that everyone today is just kind of oriented of thinking like how that problem is conventionally solved. Third one, the root challenge, it tells you what you actually do to find the key issue, the key parameter, the lever that you need to intervene into in order to eliminate that profit barrier. In this case, we call it the critical limiting operation. Again, some core activity that's driving up my costs. In the microfinance example, it was the due diligence of doing a working capital loan. And then the rest of the logic pathway. It gives you guidance on how to think about finding a science base that can support a theory of change. And lastly, how you then translate a science base into a strategy that you can circumvent it, which you then, as we've been talking about, you productize it. So to bring it again to life, let me just go through this case. This is a global food company that we were working with, and they were targeting in India, focused on nutritional deficits in rural Indian kids, high level of macronutrient deficiency. They spent a year on consumer research and R&D out of their efforts, and they were very much kind of using the lean startup approach. This is where they end up with, and they had much nicer branding. They didn't call it a fortified snack product. They actually gave it proper branding and everything. But essentially, the form of their solution was, let's fortify a snack food that then kids would be eating kind of on a regular basis. They were 2 years into the pilot when we started to work with them. They had sold hundreds of thousands of packets, but they were losing $10 million annually. And they were contemplating, they had been pivoting, trying a whole different things, and they were like, I think we've just got to like switch completely out of the informal mom and pop shop stores that they were trying to go to. Instead, like, maybe we should just switch to urban retail. And they asked us to come and say, like, well, could you give us a sense what you guys would do? And so I'm just going to run through literally those first two kind of profit barriers. And I'm not going to do it by going through and detail each of the boxes. I'll just talk to it, and you'll see how it maps onto them very naturally. But first thing we did is, like, again, we wanted to answer the question, like, where is this critical limiting operation? Like, why is this thing just fundamentally in the natural tendency for way that people would approach this problem? Because this company wasn't the only one. I had worked with several others who had done the very same thing. Everybody gravitated to a fortified snack food. And it made sense when you looked at the research, but it didn't make sense when you looked at it from a financial robustness perspective. But we went through it and, again, looked at kind of what do these operations look like. And it was so clear. Like, at the end of the day, acquiring and retaining customers, in this case the moms, you had to have this huge sustained high touch marketing, and it just completely stripped what you could actually cover in the gross margin structure that you would get with the conventional FMCG product. But then we said, all right, well, but let's really answer, like, why? Like, what is the parameter that we would have to, like, what is going on under the hood that is requiring so much high touch? And people had some theories around it, like, well, I just think, it's just the natural behavior change. It's like, yeah, but it's hard to intervene when you just think it's just natural behavior change. Like, what is it about this that is so hard on their behavior? And we probed this using the method, or the filling in one of the boxes. We came to, like, scientifically, from a pure psychological level, mom's identity, her literally core personal identity and status in her role in the home, in the community, it's all centered around cooking. And if the kids don't eat her food, it's an enormous blow to their ego and status. So actually trying to get them to buy some food to get their picky kids to eat and get good nutrition is literally like a failure of the mom. It's the last thing she would want to do, because she's cooking really healthy food as it is. We went through then looking at, what are sciences? Like, what does the science tell us about, like, how do you get around this? Like, when you probe, like, what's behind and under this? And we landed on, call it, positive psychology, the self-affirmation theory. And ultimately we came out with the strategy of saying, like, rather than trying to replace mom's food, we're finding something in addition to it. Find a vehicle for it. What's a food vehicle that gets kids to eat mom's food, which is already nutritious, rather than replacing it? And the synergy here was that, we could actually eliminate all the fortification that currently was also a key cost driver in the venture. Next thing we did, and I got this little Horlicks thing on here, because it's what a really popular product called Horlicks does in the market. Horlicks is a way to get kids to drink milk. I think we have, like, Ovaltine in the US. And Horlicks, you just, it's sold through pharmacies. You add it into the milk, it makes it taste good, and now kids will drink the milk that they otherwise wouldn't. And the next thing we did, we were like, all right, let's go to where the second, profit barrier is, and that's, we call it looking and eliminating it from the customer side of the equation. What is the big value bottleneck that's pressing down what we can solve for the customer? And we looked in here, like, where's the biggest monetizable problem? And we call it, like, where's there the real pain and suffering that we can credibly eliminate and really move the needle on? And it turned out, unlike a lot of kind of, I wouldn't say, like, the tendency for a lot was just to say, like, let's just position this aspirationally. This is good for your kids. They'll get into better schools. They'll get better jobs. We know that we will never move the needle. We would never have any credibility on that. We couldn't change that outcome for the customer. But the real outcome where we could really move the needle on, that was important for the customer, was for the mom, in terms of, like, she had this enormous shame and just fear that was associated with their kids not eating her own food. And not to sound crass, but shame and eliminating shame is a very monetizable pain and suffering that somebody feels. But again, we probed underneath this, like, why? Why is it so hard to get kids to eat the food to begin with that's causing the shame? And it just comes out with some of the basic things that science and nutrition science shows us, that the healthy eating generally, it's not how people eat. They don't eat just for, like, sustenance. They eat for enjoyment. And when you're, like, forcing someone to eat for health, it's punishment. It almost, like, detracts from the core outcome they're seeking. So you look into, like, what does the science say? You look into psychology again. We get into this, the theory of temptation bundling. which, put into common language, look, if we can gamify the food experience, we can link the routine of something that today isn't fun to something that's, really pleasant and drives novelty, we can overcome it. And so, like, how do these things merge together? How do we now triangulate, bring two strategies together into the product? We've got a food vehicle strategy, a food gamification strategy, all built around solving kind of this big problem. And we end up with, and I changed it here just to genericize it, but like a fun food taco jar that's got an advent calendar lid that provides the kid a game that they have to go in for every day, where they have to open up. The jar contains not something snacks, but it actually contains, think of it like a taco shell that then is used, and the actual game itself requires kids to fill the taco shell with the food that mom has already eaten. And there's, as in you get in an advent calendar, some kind of a treat and reward when you do that, which can be connected to some other kind of a nutritional benefit. And just to wrap it up with this one. So some of the other things that, eventually came out, other kind of, when other profit barriers were being circumvented, and end up looking at getting the rural chemist and the pharmacy as your gateway partner into mom's routines. In doing so, we now are able to establish health credentials with mom and avoid all the noise that otherwise today kind of happens in the conventional channels. People buy snacks. We've got this reusable jar that circumvents big cogs that's otherwise in here. We're able to now just repurchase advent calendar lids and the shells, but we eliminate what otherwise becomes like a big throwaway cost for customers. Having an app-based game that's connected to the calendar so that we can get around the customer flight issue and build up value that the customer keeps bringing them back to. We use the Tamagotchi, if you guys know what that is, as a reference point. Okay, hopefully that was helpful in bringing things to life. We're going to jump now to getting some reflections from Mark. I'll let Mark do a quick introduction again of himself. And Mark, as I mentioned, was an ER in the Built to Hold lab, worked with us for and really brought just some powerful expertise. He straddles both VC, corporate innovation, and so he has just such a unique perspective. And so, Mark, I guess after you just introduce yourself, if you could just honestly just reflect on some of the stuff we shared, because I know you're now applying this and doing some of this work in Ajinomoto. And maybe just like, what do you think is the most kind of key things to like really highlight and raise that you find the most important?
Yeah, thank you. It was a very exciting presentation. So yeah, to recap my background, I started my career in research in neurogenetics before moving over to commercial biotools. Went back to school while I was working in VC and got my master's in systems engineering, which is where I met the FIT team, the Build to Hold team. So a lot of my examples come out of the healthcare and biotool space, and that's a lot of what I worked on with Erik and Patrick. I wrote down a ton of notes because there are a lot of kind of rich items I wanted to cover, so I was trying to pare it down. What do I actually want to think about? And I've been reading a lot of value investing lately, a lot of Benjamin Graham, a lot of Seth Klarman, a lot of Warren Buffett. And one of the key things about value investing is in most investing, whether you're doing technicals or whether you're doing trend following or whatever, often we think about risk and return as a trade-off dynamic. You have to take on more risk in order to generate higher return. The unique aspect of value investing is when you look at undervalued companies, risk and return, you can actually decrease risk while increasing return. And I think that's what your financial margin of safety thinking is all about. That's a very unique opportunity when you're thinking about it through this lens, is the margin of safety between customer willingness to pay, fully loaded unit costs, and the value you're creating. The more you can expand that, the more you're simultaneously reducing risk and on the demand side and increasing the profit potential on the cost side. I think that's a super powerful idea. And another point I want, and we can touch on that a little bit more, but the way Patrick talks about the local optimum, that's what happens when you design an MVP often, is you move towards this beachhead market. You might be able to acquire, and this is what a lot of companies out of Y Combinator do, they might be able to acquire the first 1,000, the first 10,000 customers very quickly. They have a strong gross profit margin, really impressive stuff. They look like they're going to be hyperscalers, and then they regress to the mean because the reality is they optimize the product for a very niche set of customers, and not just about expanding beyond that niche, but when you optimize for a very niche set of customers and you optimize for buildability of your first MVP, you're pessimizing your ability to actually scale into a broader market. And if you want to scale to a broader market, that's going to show up as a massive increase in operational expenditures, whether it's OpEx on advertising, on distribution, on logistics. So I think that's the really kind of pervasive issue that shows up with the MVP notion. Is if you haven't expanded that financial margin of safety. So when you want to expand beyond your beachhead, it's structurally impossible. And you see this all the time in consumer health, which is where I spend a lot of my time thinking about it, is some of these emerging companies in kind of consumer nutrition, proactive testing, diagnostics. And we shared a lot of cases here. Pear Therapeutics from the digital therapeutic space is a great example. This idea of, can we deliver pharmaceutical efficacy, that level of efficacy and value with the cost structure of software, was very attractive. And a lot of what people get, especially VCs, get pulled into this idea of, we have, especially in software, very high gross margin, low variable cost, maximally scalable. But the reality is they're just not looking at the operational expenditures. We're looking at the product gross margin. And the reality is, with digital therapeutics and a lot of these companies, the amount they had to spend on advertising and sales and all these things required in getting the very next customer made it, they were all structurally bound to fail. So I think consumer health is an awesome place to look at case studies of where this MVP thinking really goes awry.
Awesome. Oh, that's really interesting. The value investing thing is an interesting way to think about it. What's funny is, like, I think I had a very early draft of a paper, and I used the Charlie Munger quote, because Charlie Munger said, like, he had something to the effect of, like, finance. He was looking at investing. He said, just like, usually, like, no one actually thinks about the idea of a margin of safety, which again is just it's just this central construct for anybody who's dealing where there's a lot of uncertainty and risk. I mean, it should be kind of like the starting point for thinking about, how do I now move forward? And I appreciate the kind of the shout out to margin of safety, because this is this key thing. We've tried to, what Fit Startup has done is tried to say, like, how do you operationalize what is being done today by engineers in all of these other areas and all these other applications, but apply it now to ventures. And like I said, the value investing is a really interesting one. I had never really thought about how that is such a core way they think about it. So that was super helpful.
Yeah. And so the metaphor I was thinking of also is one of the first things you introduced to me was the idea of business model whack-a-mole, which is, if you design a product and you treat the product and the business model as two different things, where the business model is essentially delivering the product that has already been optimized in the MVP form, then you're going to end up with cost structures that are blowing up in different parts of your business model, and you're going to constantly playing whack-a-mole. If you try to decrease the cost of marketing, then your revenue is going to fall. Or if you try to decrease the cost of building the product, then the value you deliver falls, and then less customers want it, fewer customers want it. So that business model whack-a-mole metaphor really clicked for me. And as I go out and I talk to innovators, you can see it all the time in the financial models that you see for seed and Series A stage companies, is they just haven't thought about the downstream operational costs that are going to show up.
We have a couple other questions that came in, but I'm wondering, because we are at time, Erik, if people that can stick around, we can continue to answer the questions. But Erik, do you want to wrap up, and then we'll go to the questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
Is there anybody that needs to drop off can see the wrap up?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll find a little wrap up slide. And that's just to say, look, we want to do another webinar. We haven't chosen a date yet, so it's a TBD. But it references back to what I mentioned with the MIT Alumni Network of applying kind of this lens to the investing side. Like, how do you actually go about using kind of the lens of robustness and those two key metrics to evaluate and screen ventures and do due diligence? And I just want to highlight some of the other things that we're going to be doing. We've got or opportunities to engage, let's call it that. One is that we've got a course that we're going to be running that's going to take a bunch of graduate engineering students through the application of those 10 profit barriers and the exercise of working around them, focused on energy related opportunity spaces. And we're looking for project sponsors and opportunities that they can then bring in that the teams would work on. We're going to be doing a 2.5-day intro to fit workshop. That's another TBD date, but it's in the next 6 or 8 weeks. And the same thing, we're launching a 12-week venture training studio. We've already done this with a couple of companies, and we're going to bring what we were doing with the companies, but bring it into a kind of the university context where we can actually have companies from a lot of members from a lot of different companies who are coming to learn together, as opposed to kind of working with companies individually. But if anything we've said here today, if you want to speak about how we can apply this individually to your company, give me and Patrick a shout. All right, with that, I will wrap this up and thank everyone again for taking your time on the Friday, and we'll hang on here and kind of keep talking.